Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we go deep on the behavioral science that is powering some of America's most popular brands. Every other week, Richard and I sit down and look at the academics that connects to practical marketing. And today, we're sitting with Sarah Carter. Sarah, welcome to Behavioral Science for Brands.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
We're so thrilled to have you. Today, we're going to be talking about some ideas and some background that you've brought today about how behavioral science has been a part of a lot of the work that you've done. Let's get into it. Okay. So Sarah, before we start our conversation today, I thought I might give everyone a little bit of your background and your history. Please don't blush while I introduce you.
Try not to.
Currently, you're the global planning partner at Adam and Eve DDB. But before you started your career at DDB, and you had spent a number of years at Unilever. So you went from brand side to agency side.
Yep.
I would imagine that had a lot of changes in that world.
It did, yes. I do think it was a really good thing to start in marketing. I mean, I still use that experience a lot now. I think you'd have a lot more credibility with clients if you seen it from that side of it. But yeah, I started I worked on fish fingers and ice cream with bird's eye walls because they were joined in that stage. And the bits I didn't know about planning, obviously, when I got that job at all, but the bits of the job that I liked were all to do with the research and with the advertising agency. The bit I didn't like so much was negotiating fish finger trade discounts with sort of Tesco buyers. So I kind of lost that bit of it and moved to the bits that I did like. So, and I was very lucky to get a job at BMP as it was then. Which little did I know was the sort of home of planning. And I just really landed on my feet. I got trained by Paul Feldwick. He was my mentor. And I got to work with John Webster, probably the greatest creative of the last 40 years who happened to work on all my accounts. So I was a lucky girl. I landed on my feet big time.
Well, luck is a part of it. And then also making your success from that. Very exciting. And so you're doing that in the 90s and early 2000s. And then in 2010, you and Les Binet started co-authoring a editorial series at AdMap.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
and it was called Mythbusters. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it was a monthly column that we started with AdMap. I think I was saying earlier we were commissioned to write it for a year, and we thought we'd probably get 12 or 13 articles, and that would be great. But yeah, little did we know we did 60, and we were still going strong. And it just all started from just wanting to kind of expose the kind of, not the theory, but the practice of the stuff that we were experiencing that made us annoyed, really. That's how we started at the coalface of planning and evaluation every day. And there were an awful lot of myths around. So we wanted to write a column just based on something that had actually happened that month that we felt other people could learn from. And we also based it on, which I think there's a lot of airbrushing going on with case studies, isn't there? It all seems a very seamless movement from strategy to brilliant ad to effect. And it isn't like that ever. And we just felt actually people learn more from the things that go wrong than the stuff that's kind of airbrushed out to look kind of perfect. So we wanted to, expose the myths, the cock-ups, the misunderstandings that we all make and help people to learn from that. And it seemed to go down really well.
How helpful for our listeners to hear, because we have lots of folks on the agency side that are listening and thinking about how to use behavioral science for their work, but lots of brand side marketers who, knowing that it's not always as seamless as the case studies tell, that's nice to hear.
It's never as seamless as the case studies tell.
Right.
But we all learn, I think, more from mistakes than things that are perfect, don't we? So that was the basis of it. So.
And then you and Les decided to combine a lot of these articles into a book.
Yeah.
Now, what's the right title? Is it How Not to Plan?
Yes, it's How Not to Plan with the not crossed out.
Yes, that's why I wasn't sure what the final title was.
Yeah.
So this
and we talked about screwing it up, didn't we? We were going to have cock it up to start with, but we weren't allowed to say that for the American market, apparently. So that's how we had to. There was a lot of discussion on the title and what we'd be allowed to.
Yes, our Puritan ears cannot.
You couldn't cope with that. Yeah.
So you published this in 2016, 2017?
Yeah, 2016, I think. Yeah. I mean, we did it in association with the APG, thanks to Sarah Newman, who sorted out the kind of production and everything of that. And she just felt it deserved a wider audience amongst planning, particularly younger planners. I mean, we're very lucky at our agency. We've got a big planning department that younger planners can learn from, but a lot of planners are on their own, or just 2 or 3 of them in an agency, and they're all hungry to learn. So, yes, she thought it would be a great thing to do to disseminate that more widely, because I don't think AdMap had a huge readership. So, yeah, we never, I think, as I said, we never set out to write a book. I don't think anyone would be arrogant enough to write a how to plan book, but we had all the articles. We found a useful structure that could kind of structure the way that we put them together. We put little top tips in it, try and made it more user friendly, and yeah, off we went.
Well, it's a book Richard and I have known about for some time. And, I think not only is it the way that you approached it, but the way that you have bullets at the end of each section that makes it supremely readable, but also actionable.
Thank you. And that is exactly the positioning we had. And I think we said in the introduction that, we've got loads of business books. I think we all have, haven't we? And most of them probably we haven't read to the end. Some of them we haven't even started. We wanted this to be a useful book. That was the positioning. And we wanted it to be kind of dog-eared and out there on planners' desk with coffee stains on it, writing it or whatever, but just use it and find it useful. And it's been really gratifying that so many comments we get back saying how useful it is, or, I've always thought all these things, but thought it was only me. And it's just so great to read that, I'm not alone and I'm not being stupid or whatever. So yeah, it's been very gratifying, actually.
And not only for advertising side, but brand side marketers will find this just as useful.
Well, I hope so. Yes. Yeah. I mean, the clients who have read it have said, a lot of them have bought it for their teams as well. I think maybe that's where my background in marketing came in as well. I mean, a lot of people seemed a bit surprised that we haven't just written about ads, that we've written about pricing and, distribution and things like that. But obviously that's all part of it. You've got to look at the other P's to work out the role for the advertising P. So I hope it has a broader readership than just planners in advertising agencies. And it seems like it is doing that because, as we all know, there's so much more information and science and brilliant stuff being done by, Orlando and yourself and Peterfield and Les or whatever. But it's still not being used as much as it should be. So to try and bridge that gap, we all need to kind of lean in and help that to happen, I think.
And the purpose for you of writing the book is the same purpose for us of doing this podcast, to take the academic insights and bring them to practical use, to have them actually used in commercial applications.
Yeah, and I think, over my long career, that's probably one of the things that's changed the most, really. When I started out, there was, the kind of academic theory stuff going on in universities, really, and then the kind of practical everyday, often based on common sense, usually wrong, and kind of ne'er the twain shall meet, really. People actually doing the stuff really sniffed at people. We positively discriminated against people who'd done marketing degrees when we started, which was terrible. It was seen like you have to learn it on the job. And the academics had never worked in the real world. So, and that's really changing now, I think.
Yeah. Why do you think that was? Why was there such a division?
I don't know, really. I think a lot of the academic work just wasn't made user-friendly, really. I mean, Mark Ritson has done the most fantastic job in sort of bridging that gap, I think, and beating the drum for proper training. I think the big companies did always do proper training. I had a lot of training at Unilever, but there were a lot of companies that didn't. So I don't know. I can't think of many fields where there would be that gap between theory and practice, but I mean,
bridge builders had a reasonable knowledge.
Yes, exactly. Yes, you don't get sort of how not to plumb books or something, do you? But it's but actually, happily for Les and I, in that gap, then lay the book, really, because we were trying to kind of bring the theory into often misplaced common sense. And then you're right. I don't think you would write that book about many other subjects. It's just it continually fascinated us. What is it about marketing? All fields have a certain sort of nonsense and that needs debugging, but it does feel like marketing and advertising has more than most. And
we've talked about how in a creative field, there's, at least in the American market, this idea that we will, like Don Draper, allow someone to go away for a weekend, lock themselves in a room, and then there's the magic idea that
Yeah.
unlocks a new brand and loads of sales.
Yes.
But when really it's a team effort,
Oh, yeah.
and a lot of science and academics can give you a much better chance of it working
Yes.
than just hoping that someone divines it
Yeah.
from above.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just that tension between knowing what the kind of rules are and the ones that are the sort of timeless rules, penetration laws, all that stuff which doesn't change, and then the bits that you can change. And people get those very muddled up. So again, that provided a lot of material for the book.
Absolutely.
Now, on the theme of practicality, you've brought some examples of brilliant work that maybe has some psychological underpinning. Do you want to take us through one of these campaigns that has been particularly successful, and we can look at some of the lessons that underlie that?
Okay, well, the one I wanted to start with was a campaign. Well, it was when I first started in the business. So this was the late 80s and 90s. One of the first, what we would now call a behaviour change campaign, but we didn't in those days, was for what was called the Health Education Authority, and it was on public information work we did on HIV and AIDS. And for people, probably a lot of the people listening to this actually weren't even born then, so don't appreciate quite a horrific time it was. So this was a new disease, very little known about it, no cure, no treatment, and was fatal. So in some parallels with the kind of pandemic, I guess, recently with what's been going on, but two very important differences. One, that it was mostly, but not entirely sexually transmitted, which this was a time when there was a huge amount of embarrassment and ignorance and shame around sex generally. The other thing, it was largely, but again, not entirely, focused amongst the gay community to start with. And this was a time of horrific prejudice and discrimination against the gay communities. So it was a fascinating kind of communication exercise, but an awful lot going on to sort of unpick in terms of behaviour change. But the ads that I was focused on, which I think you're going to be able to
We'll put
see,
in the show notes so everybody can watch them after.
are two called Mrs. Dawson and Mr. Brewster. And they both had so there were lots of different strands of communication, as you can imagine, at this time, as knowledge about HIV and AIDS grew. So we had to tell people, how it was spread, how you would know someone who had it, latest sort of information, lots and lots of public information. So, but these two ads were part of a campaign which was targeted at young adults, sexually active, but all young adults, not just the gay community. And it had a very clear behavioural objective to get them to buy and use condoms. And this was a very different time. Again, people would find this hard to understand now, how much kind of shame and embarrassment there was around condoms then. Nobody even said the word very much. I mean, in groups, people would say, I don't really know how to say it. No one talked about it. It was very sort of condom usage generally was kind of metaphorically and literally hidden. You had to ask chemists to sort of get it off the shelf at the back. So there was just an enormous amount of embarrassment around it. That was one of the issues. But the other issue was perceptions and a little bit of reality of kind of reduced experience as a result of it. So two pretty big barriers to usage. And I chose it because I think it's a really good example of a campaign that tells you, as we all know, but sometimes forget, just finding a problem, telling people what the solution is and just expecting them to do something about it just ain't how it works, really. You've got to work out the barriers and how you overcome them. So,
right. The rational side of this is, if you use a condom, you will have less transmission.
Yes.
And it will
job
stop.
done, and
right.
off you go.
Right.
But that wasn't going to happen. So these two ads tackled two sort of different things, really. The first one, and we'll talk about the behavioural in the economics principles, but I was just saying earlier, we never used that word. We didn't think of it like that at all. But Mrs. Dawson, just to explain what happened. So this was about removing or try to normalise condom usage and behaviour, really. But I just think it did it in such a smart way. So you would perhaps nowadays think you would take an influencer who in their influency way talks to Gen Z about condom use, but this was I think she was in her 60s. So this was a real woman who worked in a condom factory in North London. She was called Mrs. Dawson. And you see her on the production line. So she's got her, factory coat and a hat on, a cap thing. And she's very perfunctorily pulling condoms off the production line as they come along. And
which takes a few seconds to realise. I don't know.
Yes,
it was just, I think it takes a few seconds to realise they're condoms.
They look very strange. So kind of visually quite interesting. Yeah. And there's the noise of the factory going on in the background. And she's saying, we're the first to know here when there are changes in behaviour. Young people now, they've got their heads screwed on. They know, they obviously realise that if they wear a condom, it protects them at age of 8. I've never been so busy. And then at the end, it finishes with keep Mrs. Dawson busy, use a condom. So, I mean, we can go on to talk about the principles behind that. But just if you think about how normalising that was in terms of the routineness of it being talked about in that way by that sort of person, very relatable. She looked like your nan, really. Presumably social proof. You tell me is the kind of main way that works. Like, this is normal. Everyone's doing it. People are doing it more and more.
So I certainly agree. I think there's a really strong element of social proof. Which is this idea of if you say something's happening a lot, people at least consider whether it's the right behaviour for them, and it's more likely to occur. But what's fascinating is most campaigns that use social proof do it in a very literal-minded, perfunctory way.
Yeah.
I can imagine another agency might have just put up a line saying, condom sales are up by 7.5%, or 300,000 condoms get sold every hour.
Yes.
But talking about Mrs. Brewster and the production lines changing,
is a very smart way of saying the sales are high, isn't it? It's
much more distinctive and noticeable.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And just about, I mean, is that, so I know you talk about the messenger effect at all. Is that a relatable one or a neutral one? I don't know quite what. So it's quite interesting why that works as an old.
So the messenger effect is essentially this idea, like the first studies were done back in the 1950s by Hovland and Weiss, which essentially show that who says something is as important as what's said.
Yes.
And later work seems to suggest there tend to be 3 types of messenger that work well. Someone who has expertise.
Yeah.
So you can imagine an ad using a doctor.
Yes.
Someone who is neutral.
Right.
So it's not a government spokesperson. So this ad fulfills that.
Yeah.
Or someone who is relatable.
Yeah.
So those 3 tend to be the most normally used messages.
Would you call her neutral or relatable? Because she is a bit like your nan, isn't she? But she's also kind of neutral as well.
Yeah, I think she's neutral. Relatable is a fascinating one because most people who try to apply relatability, the immediate thing you would jump to would be someone who
looks like me.
Yeah, is a 25-year-old, very sexually active person.
Yes.
But often the first answer you leap to is not the best one.
Yes.
And I think, as you say, if your nan can be comfortable talking about condoms and sex, why the hell am I as a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old embarrassed about it?
Yeah.
So I think it takes these biases which could be applied in a successful way and just maximizes the impact through the creativity.
Because you could have had a young girl on the production line equally well, and it wouldn't have been the same, would it? Because she would have been relatable, as you say, to the audience. But I don't know, it just certainly didn't feel like it would have the normalizing effect.
But the bias, though, I think the single most powerful bias, I think, and this differentiated it very much from the other ads at the time. And again, it's worth emphasising how HIV/AIDS was so different in the 1980s in that it was a death sentence, not a manageable disease, was it would have been very easy for an agency to tell people, wear a condom or you're going to die.
Yes.
Through fear. And we had many of those fear adverts.
Yeah.
But the danger from a behavioural science perspective is there's a series of studies into what's called the ostrich effect.
Yes, yes.
So the original study was that done by George Lowenstein, where he was given access by a financial company to anonymise data on how often people check their stock portfolios. And what he basically found was that when the stock market rises, and if people check into their portfolios, they're going to get good news, people were checking regularly. When the stock market's plummeting, people check in a lot less. Now, he said this is a logical mistake, because the information about your wealth is equally useful in both circumstances. But he said people don't behave logically. They have a rule of thumb, which is if something causes me pain or discomfort, I'll either ignore that problem or I'll go through intellectual gymnastics to explain why it doesn't apply to me.
Yeah.
So he called it the ostrich effect. And I think much health advertising normally falls victim to it.
And the preceding campaigns very much did that. As you know, the infamous iceberg ad, do you remember that? Which was literally crashing kind of lightning and an enormous kind of gravestone and sort of, don't die of ignorance and all. I mean, absolutely terrified sort of little grannies who got no chance of catching this at all. But it was indiscriminate fear, really.
I was a 12-year-old boy, I think, when that
right. Do you remember that?
came out. I think it was one that ended on a tombstone.
Yes, it did.
Absolutely.
Yes, it did.
Horrifying.
Yeah.
But often what happens with those ads, even though they're very well-meaning, is people will just stop thinking about the issue at all.
Yes.
And because it caused them discomfort.
Yeah.
So introducing condoms and AIDS with a dash of levity and lightheartedness and humour encourages people to engage with the problem and change their behaviour. It's far more likely they'll change their behaviour.
And this underscores the second ad that you brought in the same creative. It's Mr. Brewster.
Yes. Yeah.
And in the same way, it's who's delivering it almost more than what they say.
Absolutely.
Can you explain that one a little bit?
Well, it's another one you think you wouldn't naturally put an 81-year-old man like your grandpa into this kind of campaign. But so this was Mr. Brewster. He was a real person. He was 81. He was sitting in his old brown armchair at home, and he was talking about his trusty friend Geronimo, who it turns out was his reusable condom that he used to use when he was a lad. So he's got a real twinkle in his eye, Mr. Brewster, and he's saying, I don't know why young people nowadays complain about using a condom. Look what I had to use. It was like the inside of a bicycle tire.
There's not much exaggeration.
No, and then he pulls it out as this matchbox thing, and it does look like an inner tube, doesn't it? And then he says, and they weren't disposable in those days. You had to take when you finished using it, I think he said, you had to kind of wash it down, dust it off, and put it away for another day. And he does a little sort of chuckle and he said, never stop me there. Or, so it was all very kind of, and then it finished like, if Mr. Brewster can wear this condom, you can wear one. So I guess a huge reframing exercise, presumably.
Absolutely. Because I think the danger is if things are left as they are, the comparison is wearing a condom, not wearing a condom.
Yes.
And there might be some loss of sensation.
Yes.
But if you shift the comparison from wearing a condom to wearing an inner tube of a bicycle tire, suddenly it reframes.
It's like having a bath with your socks on.
And this connects to something, Sarah, we were talking about before the episodes, before we started filming, which is sometimes great strategists and great creatives intuitively use these behavioral science techniques without them being named or without knowing what they are.
Yeah.
That doesn't make them any less impactful.
No.
And in fact, it helps those of us who may not have that strike of genius to have a better chance at our messaging connecting or our ideas working when we base it on that. But you were commenting on this.
Yes, I mean, I worked on these. We never used any of these sorts of names or principles. They were very much kind of intuitive. I mean, we would talk about the need to normalize condoms, and we would talk about, trying to. I don't actually even remember how the Mr. Brewster thing. I'm not sure we even knew about I have no idea. I think that must have come from the creative teams, but they're often the best kind of strategists anyway. They come up with this stuff intuitively. The other thing we hadn't talked about was the media plan, because these went out in cinema and national primetime TV, which again, even just that context of putting condoms and being talked about in public like that, again, took them off the kind of metaphorical back shelf and got them out into the open.
Yes, it would have had a completely different effect in a piece of direct mail or a magazine where it's privately read. There's something very powerful about being in a communal environment and seeing other people maybe laugh at the ad as well.
And in cinemas, particularly where people are on dates and probably are going to go home and have sex afterwards anyway. It was a brilliant bit of... So the whole thing, it was... it was just a fascinating and it did. Well, it actually won an effectiveness paper, so people can read about it on WARC. It won a silver effectiveness paper. Well, the whole of our HIV comms kind of work did, but it did, when we tracked it, it did significantly change attitudes to condoms and behavior. So, I mean, it was a game-changing, generational change, really, in how people felt. I mean, and and it also led to condoms being sold on the shelves in supermarkets, which people now toss them in with your kind of potatoes and carrots, don't they? So it's just, I'm sure people listening will just can't believe it wasn't always like this, but it really wasn't. And I'm just really proud of that work. I think it's really, really interesting. I'm very interested in old people in ads generally as well, because we talked about it a lot in the book. There's just that one of the big myths is that people need to see literally themselves in ads, and it's just a brilliant example of how you don't need to do that. You need to feel yourself in ads, but not see yourself literally. So it's a brilliant example of how you talk to young people with people who are over 70 and 80, which is not where you'd normally go.
And there's that, I think it's a John Hegarty phrase, that success of an ad is 80% strategy and 80% execution.
Yes.
And it does feel like there was a brilliant element of casting.
Yes.
You go through the same strategy of using a 60, 70-year-old, using social proof, using the ostrich effect, and still not have the same effect.
Absolutely.
There feels like there's a bit of magic in that.
Definitely,
that
because you could have played that so much more safe, couldn't you? Could have gone with a 40-year-old woman, or a kind of, a grandson talking to his grandpa about, you could have played it safe, but we really lent into it, and it made it stand out as well. And they're very joyful ads, aren't they? They're very life affirming, and there's a kind of positivity and a sense of hope about them as well, which is stark contrast to that gravestone thing we were talking earlier.
Absolutely.
I've heard you talk, Sarah, in other interviews about how casting and music plays a outsized role in the effectiveness. Maybe just for the listeners who may have not heard your point of view on this, you just share a little bit about your thinking on this?
Well, I mean, it's not just my thinking, is it? All Orlando's work at the moment on, and the System 1 work generally on right brain, the importance of emotion, the sense of character, setting, story. I mean, these ads are brilliant examples of that, aren't there? There's just such a sense of, we all know these people. You can imagine the home Mr. Brewster lives in, or you could write a story about Mrs. Dawson and where she lives and her family. You get a sense of these people. So there's a sort of specificity in that, and a narrative that engages all the bits of our brain that we know work to get attention and make us feel things and make us remember things. And if you think of the other ways you could have done it with scientists, with blackboards or whatever, and pipettes and things like that,
but the rational side is not going to get the job done.
No, not at all. So it's wonderful character and storytelling, really, isn't it? And playing to those bits of our brain that work, but they're so easy to get ironed out, isn't it? I talk a lot about the best ads, I think, have what I call little burrs. Those things when you walk through fields and they stick on your feet, those little bits that stick out that kind of catch you. I think the best work has those, and that's where the magic happens. But it's so easy to iron those out. You could have said, "Oh, condoms, they look a bit funny on that production line. We won't really show them." Or, Mr. Brewster, I'm not sure we really want to see one of those. Or you could iron so much out of all that, couldn't you? And you'd lose all them, or you would put some music in the background or something. I don't know. But it's the little things often that have the biggest influence on us, I think, in comms, and it's the stuff that's very easy to lose in terms of the magic in the wrong hands. So it's what great directors bring to ads as well. I think a lot of clients think, you've got a validated storyboard, you just shoot the storyboard and off you go. But it's the magic that all that other stuff that's brought to it, that's just the start point, really, the storyboard. The magic happens after that.
And so that was your first ad that you were thinking of. The second one that you were bringing was Eat Them to Defeat Them.
Yes,
talk about what the ad was to begin with, and then why you think it was so effective.
Yeah. Well, the reason I chose this is, generally speaking, the decisions that we try to influence with our comms are pretty inconsequential, really, aren't they? Whether you're going to eat a kind of raspberry yogurt or a vanilla one or whatever, they're not really great. But I chose these because clearly wearing a condom at that time was an life-saving sort of behavioural changes. And this one eat them to defeat them was another really important behavioural influencing campaign, and it was about trying to get kids in the UK to eat more veg, because obesity levels here, as in the States, are rising.
Yes.
Really worryingly rising amongst young kids as well. Huge percentage are obese by the time they leave primary school. Lots of data on the fact that, they only eat baked beans and they won't eat any veg at all. Years and years of public health campaigns trying to get kids to eat more veg, using all the, kind of most immediate ways that you think of. You'll grow stronger if you eat veg. You'll be better at sports if you eat veg. You'll be kind of healthier if you eat veg. They don't taste so bad, really, if you mince them up and put them in.
Yeah.
None of it worked. None of it worked. So something different had to happen. And this was a campaign that was brought about by a campaigning kind of food organisation in association with ITV.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the creative work is lovely, but I think the strategy is the most interesting bit of it, because it feels to me, you're the expert on this, like the mother of all reframing exercises, really. So it says kids hate veg, they don't like the taste of it. You're not going to change that, so let's just go with it. And we're not going to try and say to you that that these are good things. We're actually going to say veg are evil, they're villains, and we need you to defeat them. So the ad, you'll be able to have a look at it, but it says they come from deep in the earth. They're fueled by water and sunlight, and it talks about how the adults have been trying to defeat these evil things, but they've kind of lost control, and we need you kids to help out. So you need to eat them to defeat them. And then you've got lots of shots of kids like, you're going down, P, and things like that, trying to sort of defeat these evil villains. And to me, it's just a wonderful bit of creative strategy, really. You go with what, I think you call it the pleasure versus duty thing. Do you? It feels like it's that, but you go with what kids like. So they like feeling in control and having a sense of agency. They love games and feeling that they're winning and they're competing against villains and losers, and they like having fun. So you apply all that to eating veg, and you say veg are the villains, you can conquer them, we need you, and you do it with a load of fun, and it works. And it's just the most wonderful strategy, I think.
I certainly think that the behavioural science argument would be, as you say, and I phrase sometimes as appeal over duty.
Yes.
That sometimes when people have a social good cause or an ethical cause, they focus on the moral reasons to change behaviour or the duty reasons for changing behaviour. There's an awful lot of experimentations that suggest that's not ideal.
Yeah.
So in the world of veg eating, there's a lovely study from Bradley Turnwald at Stanford. So back in 2017, worked at a cafe for 6 or 7 weeks, and they alternate the labels of the vegetables. So sometimes it's all about healthiness in a restrictive way, low calorie beets.
Yeah.
Other occasions he labels them in an indulgent way, sizzling beets in a tangy citrus sauce. And what he shows is that when they alternate week on, week off, when those vegetables are labelled in that indulgent way, they sell about 41%.
Yeah.
So his argument is just because they're good for you, you don't have to lead with the goodness message.
Yes.
Just like with any other product, like a lager or a trainer, focus on that.
Yes.
That fun aspect.
Yes.
And it's rare when you look at actual communications that lesson is applied.
Yes.
And what's so interesting about the eat them to defeat them is, again, it feels like this principle of appeal over duty has been pushed even further. It's not just talking about their indulgence and their taste.
Yes.
It's turning it into a game. It's making it even more fun than I think any experiment would have tested.
Yes. And there were other elements that, I mean, there were sort of charts, because kids love charts, don't they, and stickers, and there'd be a veg of the week that you had to sort of defeat that week. And so the thing was sort of gamified, really, as well. And I guess there's also this messenger effect going on, isn't it? That there's no authority in there at all. It's kids saying, we need you other kids to help us defeat them. And I love the idea of getting people to do the right things for the wrong reasons. I think this is a really good example of that as a strategy. And we don't do it half enough. in the whole world of purpose, and we're not really going to get into that as well, but it just feels like, it came at it the wrong way. And this is just a lovely example of, you're not, they might be not eating it because it's good for them, but they are eating it more. That's all that matters, isn't it? So
there's a lovely quote from Mike Cesario, who founded Liquid Death.
Yes.
And he talks about how he found it strange that the devil has all the good tunes, that it's lagers and it's crisps and it's sweets, which have the fun characters and the wit.
Yeah.
And his thought was simply, well, why can't we do this for healthy, environmentally friendly products?
Yes.
So they took all those lessons that beer and crisps know so well and applied them to water.
Yeah, really good example.
Right. Why don't more brands who have a ethical purpose or a health benefit keep that as their reason internally? But when it comes to communicating with the public, make it fun, make it amusing, make it...
No, absolutely. And that's another whole discussion why that happens. But it does feel like a lot of the purpose kind of misstep was it was a very performative strategy, I think, for a lot of brands and clients. And it was more important almost to be seen to be doing these things than the effect discussed. But, but it's the effect that's the important bit. You can get to it by any means that you want to, in my mind. And if you're getting kids eating more veg, who cares how you get them doing it? Doesn't matter, does it?
For me, this commercial and the last ones were new as an American. I had not been exposed to them. The thing that sticks with me from this veg commercial is the decision to make it almost cinematic when you brought it to creative.
Yes.
And that stuck with me. I watched these last week when you originally sent them, and that stuck with me today. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how the choice of making it more like an action movie underscores the strategy that you laid out.
Well,
what your thought is.
It was all part of that appeal versus duty, I think, to kids, wasn't it? You draw on sort of gaming, computer game terminology, that, as you say, the kind of cinematic kind of they came from. It couldn't be further away from a kind of eat your greens because they're good for you kind of. It was entirely in kids' kind of language, which is interesting for an advertiser because obviously usually we're not allowed to talk directly to kids, and you're not allowed to do things that, because for various very good reasons, you're not targeting them with your particular product. But this was like lean right into what kids like, and you can let rip. I mean, some of the other ideas, earlier ones we had, were about veggies make people fart and kids love farting, and we were doing all that because again probably would have worked quite well, really, because but we were very much coming from what we wanted them to do. And then, as you said, you could get them to do that for whatever reason you liked, as long as it worked. So, but yeah, you're right. All that system one type stuff was all super important. We didn't want any whiff of authority or coercion or that sense. It had to be pure fun and on their level and giving them control and a sense of agency. Because we've all got awful memories, haven't we? Being told us you can't leave the table until you've eaten your way. It's just all that stuff. You wanted to get completely away from
control
that.
is associated often with veg. And I think that's a really interesting area I hadn't quite thought of. One of my favourite studies ever was by a Harvard psychologist called Ellen Langer. So back in 1975, she goes around an office block in America and sells people lottery tickets for $1. And the twist in the experiment is some people pick their numbers and some are given their numbers.
Right.
She then waits a week, and then just before the lottery is going to be drawn, she tries to buy those tickets back. And what she finds is people that were given the numbers with no choice, they will sell them back for $1.96 on average. But the people who got to choose their numbers, they want $8.60, $8.70 to sell their tickets back. Now, that is a massive fourfold variation in valuation of what is a commodity. The lottery ticket is no more valuable if you got to pick the number. But Langer's argument is, just as you say, the retaining a sense of agency and a sense of control is one of the fundamentals of human nature.
Yes.
And the ad is a lovely example of giving children something they rarely are allowed to exercise. So, removing the authoritarian voice is a brilliant part.
I mean, I think the way that we're taught to try and get children to do things is pretty good training for human nature generally, isn't it? I mean, I know, we were always with our kids to say, like, give them a choice. Like, you can have a pea or a carrot, or you can put this coat on or this coat. You're going to wear a coat, but you're actually got the feeling that you're choosing that, and they're more likely to do it, aren't they, than just put your coat on and before we go out. So I think we probably all should study kids a bit more. And
that's a brilliant idea. And how we deal with children as parents, I think, gives us things to do as advertisers.
Yes,
but also even coming down to how we teach people to read. Think about children's books. They'll use things like rhyme and repetition.
Yes, yeah.
Fluent devices.
Yes.
All these tactics that feel too simplistic in advertising.
Yeah.
The evidence suggests they are very good at creating
I think you're right.
messages.
I'd never thought that before, but all the stuff that you do with kids is actually, getting them on board and making it easy. And we don't talk enough in advertising about making it easy for people to remember things, easy for things to come to mind. And, people aren't going to work at any of this stuff. They don't care enough. But you're right. And it's unfashionable, isn't it? Jingles and slogans and all that. But but they work. This is a bit of a thing. I don't know whether people know Peter Kay, do they, in the US?
No.
He's a very famous comedian in this country. He fills kind of stadiums with people. And I went to one of his performances at the O2 a few months ago. And the first quarter an hour of his set was him singing commercials from 40 years ago, probably. And the whole audience, tens of thousands of people, were singing these ads back to them because they were all kind of jingles and slogans. Everybody knew them word for word. There was no prompting or anything, but just people knew the word. And you think, how often is that going to happen now in 40 years' time, that people are singing back the stuff we do? But making these easy to remember is really important.
Yeah. I guess the other one that children's books do is they don't try and convey abstract concepts directly.
Yeah.
They create figures that embody those concepts. And absolutely, one of the biggest learnings in memory research is vision is the most powerful of our senses.
Yeah.
And if we can visualize language, it's very sticky.
Yeah.
Whereas if we can't visualize a word, it's very easy to forget. So there's some lovely work from Ian Begg where he reads out a list of phrases. So some will be visualizable phrases like a white horse. Others will be abstract phrases like basic truth. And when he asks people later on to remember as much as they can, 36% remember the concrete words, 90% remember the abstractions.
Yes.
So there's this massive fourfold variation. That is too rarely applied by advertisers. Advertisers will often talk about things like quality or trustworthiness. But then if you think about Aesop's fables or children's books, they have a fox or the three bears, and they have Goldilocks. They demonstrate these values that you want of, maybe avoiding extremes and risk. They don't talk about those abstract concepts directly.
No, I think
there's something there for advertisers to learn from.
Yeah, no, there are power of characters. And it's so interesting, isn't it? The crossovers between all these sort of areas. I hadn't really thought through these children things so much before, but it's really useful. And they seem, I don't know, again, people like to complicate things, don't they? I think, as you said, there's a sort of sniffiness about slogans and, jingles. It all sounds, it just feels a bit like kind of below everybody, really. But it's incredibly sophisticated communication that, as you say, repetition works, simplifying things. We can have another whole debate over Trump, but, he's pretty good communicator in terms of his Sleepy Joe and all this kind of stuff. It works.
Yes. So before we move on to our next topic, let's underscore a few key things from this conversation. Number one, just because they were old tactics in the past, like jingles, like fluent devices, characters.
Yeah.
The challenge for modern marketers is maybe not to not use them, but how to use them incredibly well.
Yes.
Right. And that is something we can all agree on is a good message for people to get. And then I think the second big takeaway is to say, what can we do to make these things more visual, more concrete, so that you can remember them when you come back to them, whether that's sight, like you said, or in jingles that are repeatable and memorable.
Yep. No, absolutely. Yep.
Very cool.
So on to your third and final ad. What were you thinking here?
So my third and final ad was a quite a long. I mean, there aren't many long-running campaigns around now, which is another issue we could talk about, the issue of consistency. But we have one for something called GWR, which stands for Great Western Railway, which is one of our railway companies here, and we have a long-running campaign, which actually apparently is one of the highest ads of System 1 of our output as an agency, and it's a long-running campaign based on a children's book from the 50s in this country called The Famous Five. But I'm sure you have similar sorts of things. Yes. There are 4 children and a dog, and they have a lot of sort of escapades, and it has a very distinctive sort of visual style, sort of sun-dappled, sort of countryside, hand-drawn animation. So our campaign for this railway, and the railway, which I should say, goes down to the western country of England. So for your American listeners, it's Cornwall, Devon. So it's beautiful seaside sort of holiday locations, and it's the main train line that goes down there. And the Famous Five books in the UK were the family. They used to go to boarding school, the kids, and every holiday they'd go off and have an adventure and stay by the seaside with their auntie and uncle. So there's a whole brand world that's incredibly evocative around that particular countryside where this train goes to. And this animated world has been the basis of a campaign we've run for a number of years. But the ad I've chosen, it says, is called Train versus Car. And basically it's to encourage people to take the train down to the West Country when they go on holidays rather than drive. And again, I think it's another example of, you could do quite a rational sustainability message on that, talking about how it's much more sustainable to travel by train than cars. But it's another example of possibly getting people to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, because it's a wonderful storytelling, again, narrative story, characters, setting, story, the story of how the 4 kids and their dogs go down on the train for their holiday, while their auntie and uncle who look after them decide they're going to go by car. And it's like, who gets there first? And it's a kind of a sort of harem-scarum trip with
hilarity ensues.
Yes, the car gets sort of stuck behind tractors and fumes belch into them. And anyway, the kids and the dog get there first on there. So they're all having a lovely picnic on the beach by the time auntie and uncle arrive with the car. But again, it's another of your kind of don't go down the duty. What was it? Not pleasure versus duty. Appeal versus duty. Yeah. So make the train feel appealing. There's no mention of sustainability or anything in there. And it's wonderful System 1 storytelling. If you look at the comments on YouTube, people love this world. It's incredibly evocative to them. Just simple stories, but it's incredibly effective. So.
And, as a person that did not have a connection to the books or to the railway, I didn't know it was auntie or uncle or mom or dad.
No,
didn't know that there was a history of world built, but I did care that the kids got there, and I was laughing that the adults did not.
Yeah.
And you can feel at the end when they all finally meet on the beach.
Yeah.
All is
well. It always ends well. Yes.
But that's it. But that just proves it taps into the emotional nature of the connection rather than the rational argument of sustainable railways.
And a lot of these examples, I think, are really good. If you think, well, how else could you have done that? You could have used younger people on a factory production line. You could have talked about sustainability message. You could have said vegetables are good for you, but they wouldn't have worked. And so they look very obvious in retrospect, don't they? But I think there's just very smart strategies behind them. They're not necessarily intentionally done with behavioural economics principles at heart, but that you learn an awful lot about them from when they do work.
Yeah. I think the other really striking thing, and this differentiates it from so many ads, is within a second or two, you immediately recognise it for being GWI. It has a completely distinctive visual style.
Yes.
If it's a print ad, you could cover over the logo and people would recognise it straight away.
Yeah.
That's a very rare feature of a campaign, but one that's phenomenally powerful.
And has been built over the years, I suppose. And that's the sort of consistency principle, isn't it? Which again, I think people have have actually finally come around to. I remember when Les and I wrote the article about there isn't any such thing as wear out in the book, which was probably could even have been about 9 years ago now. I mean, that felt really radical then. No one was saying that, but System One have done huge amounts of work, haven't they, on Coke trucks and Aldi carrots, and I think everybody now is realizing the power of consistency, but fresh consistency. I mean, no one's saying show the same ad literally year on year, but keeping your things that make you distinctively you in a very intentional way, rather than feeling you need to kind of deliberately kind of be disruptive every year, which has been a mantra in the past.
And it certainly fits with experimental evidence. There's a classic study going back to the late 60s by I think it was Polish-American psychologist called Zion, where he recruits people and he does the experiment in 3 different occasions. So on one occasion, it's a group of Americans, don't speak Chinese at all, and he shows them pictures of Chinese characters. So there's this big book, they flick through, they look at these Chinese characters, and the twist in the experiment is sometimes the characters are just shown to them once, sometimes twice, sometimes 5 times, sometimes 25 times. And then after they've flicked through the book, they are shown the characters one more time and asked to say what they think the characters mean. And what he shows is that the more people have been exposed to the characters, the more positive word they attribute to that bit of writing. Now, the key thing is there's no information given about these characters. So he calls it the mere exposure effect. It's the fact that it's repeated that builds this preference, not extra information being given. So he argues familiarity breeds contentment, not contempt. And I think that is an area that could be applied far more broadly. Seeing this consistency and repetition as a positive, not as a negative.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other build on this is that when we work with brands, they're looking for what their distinctive assets could be. I think they often look to their packaging, to their logo. And what you've done brilliantly here is you've associated this world. And as you say, if you blocked out the logo, you would still know it's the railway. It's a distinctive asset that you can reuse over and over again to build that association.
Yes.
So you think as much about the kids and the dogs as you do about the logo, to make that world and to make that distinctive asset reusable over and over again.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It is very much a brown world, isn't it? It's not just and to animate a train is quite a brave thing. I mean, it'd be, you could imagine a lot of people would actually like to show their
actual train
in real life, and but to animate everything is brave, but it is distinct. Is it the von Restorff effect? Just the fact that it does really stand out, as you say. You've probably seen the posters at stations and things as well. It is, and on trains they use it. It's an incredibly distinctive thing, that animated world with that lovely dappled sort of sunlight, and it's just very evocative, isn't it?
Yeah, and absolutely. I think I love the word evocative because it is evocative of childhood as well.
Yeah,
the style plus the
yes.
Do you say he was Enid Blyton famous for?
I think it was. Yeah.
And there is some really interesting work from people like Lassalita that suggests if you remind people of childhood, they become less price sensitive. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, I think the argument being, if we think about now, money is very important and has a huge impact on our lives. But if you think back to your childhood memories, it's often other attributes of life that loom large. So she's shown that by getting people to think back to their childhood, they become less price sensitive. So I think there might be another benefit potentially from creating that past world, that nostalgic world.
Yes, and interestingly, not talking sustainability, but actually positioning it in a world gone by rather than a kind of a future fit world as well. Lots of I hadn't thought about that, but I'm sure that helps hugely as well. Very good.
Amazing. Sarah, as we come to a close, we ask every guest this question.
All right.
Our listeners are always on the lookout for things that are interesting, things that are provocative, or just things that we all are finding interesting and exciting. Something that you're reading, something that you're watching. It does not have to be related to behavioral science, but is there something in Sarah Carter's life that you're finding interesting, engaging right now?
Oh my God, I wasn't expecting that question. Something funny, interesting, expecting.
Something that's taking your time up that you're enjoying right now.
I've gone completely blank. I don't know what I'm going to say on that.
You can take a moment. We're whole people, and so it's interesting to hear about what other interesting people are interested in. Anything comes to mind?
Well, no, not really. But I mean, only that I suppose what I would finish with is just my thing that it's an interesting thing that I've said in the past, and probably the only thing that I've said that just circulates on social media more than anything, which is this idea about the post-it note that marketers should have by their desks saying that people really don't give a shit, and that consumer indifference is the sort of start point of everything that we should do. And so much flows from that if you get that start point right. And I just think it's such an easy thing to forget for everybody, and just everyday things crop up that make you think actually that really isn't the right start point. And the things that we've talked about today are very much illustrative of that as well. I think that you don't need to pump rational messages about people. You can get people to do the right things for the wrong reasons, but as long as you start from the point of what really matters to people and look at it from that side of the telescope rather than our side, then that's where the magic and the potency and the effectiveness comes from. And it's just a timeless lesson, I think, that we find very easy to forget, and it's really important that we remind ourselves of.
This is the statement when you hear people say advertising is a weak force. That is the science or whatever. That's the abstract way to say what you're saying.
Yeah. Yes. It's just look at it from the right end of the telescope. Really, that things that matter a lot to us are important to us. Seem like really big differences to us. Don't impute them onto other people. Well, it goes back to what we were saying about how not to plumb. I mean, there's this sort of weird imbalance in our job, isn't there, between the level of interest and nuance and sort of potency we put on things compared with people at the other end who are going about their lives. If my lue's broken and I get you in to mend it, I'm as vested in that as you are. But if I'm making an ad for you, it's such a little thing in your life, that brand and that ad, but it's such a massive thing in my life. And if you lose that sense of that there's a difference there, then sort of everything goes wrong, really. So
you can see that in the ads that you've been talking about. The very first one, the Mrs. Brewster ad.
Yes.
If you assume the audience was attentive, well, then it might be a sensible decision to replace the 60-year-old character with someone a bit blander. It might be a sensible decision not to show the condoms being bizarrely stretched out. But if you assume the audience is indifferent and not paying attention, suddenly those quirks and unique piece of specificity, they're crucially important. So I think that's a lovely place to end.
Specificity is a really important thing, generally. I think it's that the idea that there is general appeal in specificity is something, again, that people find really hard to get, and that's the reason you get such a lot of kind of bland, lowest common denominator stuff. You just think, it's only going to be old people who can relate to an old person. Yeah, but that's not how it works at all. You have to be specific to get the general kind of appeal from it. If you come in the other way around and just make it all kind of blandly appealing to everybody, then you lose the character, the setting, the story. You can't tell stories in general ways. They demand specificity, don't they?
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating, because you could argue maybe it's a danger of kind of a Byron Sharp approach to the world, or a misinterpretation. That there is an argument that brands need to target the whole market. But when it comes to the message and the creative that you use, if you try and be that general and that bland, you lose relevance to anyone.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think there's a real interesting tension.
And Hollywood film, they get that. Don't they? I mean, Slumdog Millionaire. We don't live in slums. We don't live in. But we all relate to the story that by chance you might know the answers to something that could change your life, and so you have to have specificity. But important principle.
Beautifully said.
We could be here all day chatting, but we can't.
And maybe we'll entice you back,
Yes,
Sarah, for another time.
Happy for a chat another time.
This was lovely. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
And until next time, we'll ask those listening, if you found this of use, please write a comment, follow us on YouTube. It helps us reach other people like you who would be interested in the conversations we're having. And until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Chilton.
And you are
Sarah Carter.
Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Function Growth, Ad Age's 2023 Newcomer Agency of the Year. Your D2C business isn't broken, you're just doing it wrong. By fusing advanced technology and behavioral science, Function Growth solves the biggest problems faced by today's DTC brands. Visit us at www.functiongrowth.co to learn more.